Such were the expectations of the Comet that even before the prototype had flown, production work had already begun on 16 others, 14 of which were for BOAC. These expectations began to be realized when, in October 1949, John Cunningham flew the Comet from London to Tripoli and back in a single day. 6 months later, the Comet was to set up a new point-to-point record between London and Cairo. With its airworthiness certificate obtained in 1952, its future was set, and on May the 2nd of that year, the world saw the first scheduled jet airliner service operating between London and Johannesburg in a little over 23 hours. The Comet 1 had reached BOAC a full 6 months ahead of schedule, and with interest spreading, UAT of France became the first overseas operator with the slightly higher capacity 44-seater Comet 1A. But suddenly, on May the 2nd, 1953, there came disaster. It was exactly a year after the inaugural flight.
The Comet 1 had 1 year's entirely satisfactory service, and on the anniversary of its start of service with BOAC, a Comet taking off from Calcutta flew into a violent thunderstorm and failed structurally.
It was the worst disaster in the 13-year history of BOAC. Subsequent investigations determined, and eyewitnesses' accounts confirmed, that this tragic incident was, in the words of one report, an act of God. The Comet 1 had been the victim of a violent thunderstorm.
Rolls-Royce were meanwhile developing the Avon engine, which was somewhat more powerful than the Ghost and rather more fuel efficient.
DeHavilland's introduced, on August the 27th, 1953, the new Comet 2, and world interest was justifiably sustained. But then...
Champino, this is George Peter, passing flight level 260 for cruising altitude 360.
All right, J.O. Peter, passing flight level 260.
George Oak Peter from George Howjig, understand you're passing 260. What's the cloud cover? George Howjig from George Oak Peter. Did you get my last?
That was the last heard from BOAC Comet 1 Yoke Peter, shortly after it took off from Rome's Ciampino airport. Less than a minute after Captain Alan Gibson's unfinished message to another BOAC aircraft, two fishermen off the coast of Elba witnessed the first blow that was to shake the very foundations of world civil aviation. I heard 3 explosions, one fisherman said. Then, several miles away, I saw a silver thing flash out of the clouds. By the time I got there, all was still. Yoke Peter was lost with all on board. In Great Britain, BOAC and the nation in general were shocked by the news. Ironically, it had been Yoke Peter that was used by BOAC for the inaugural flight of Comet services. But as the bodies of 15 victims were brought to the Isle of Elba by local fishermen, BOAC had no choice but to ground all its Comets. Witnesses were fine, but if there was to be more than mere speculation to go on, Yoke Peter would have to be brought to the surface. The Royal Navy vessel Sea Salver, with the most up-to-date salvage equipment on board, began an immediate search of the area. Back in Great Britain, the grounded comets had been thoroughly inspected and some 50 modifications suggested. Reinforced shields were placed between the engines and fuel tanks, the fuel lines reinforced, and safeguards against the buildup of hydrogen were improved, and extra fire and smoke detectors fitted. But still there remained only speculation as to the fate of Yoke Peter. Even as the comets were being modified, the Royal Navy, using sonar and underwater television cameras, began to locate pieces of Yoke Peter's twisted carcass. By the end of February, they had retrieved a large section of the comet's tail, several seats, and 2 sections of fuselage from well over 400 feet of water. On March the 31st, the grappling hooks locked onto the entire forward section of the cockpit. The flight engineer was still strapped in his seat, and strangely, the cabin roof was missing. The pieces, which by now included engines, undercarriage, wing spars, and fuselage skin, were flown back to Great Britain and began to be assembled on the floor of a hangar at the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough. But on March the 23rd, Comets modified, BOAC resumed services. Every seat was taken. Confidence was restored in the Comet. The painstaking task of detailed reconstruction continued, and Yoke Peter began to take on an eerie shape. Just 2 weeks later, disaster struck again. Yoke, a Comet 1, crashed minutes after takeoff from Rome. This time it was night. There were no witnesses and no clues. The airworthiness certificate was withdrawn, and at parliamentary insistence, the investigation took on a new urgency. And although development was allowed to continue on the Comet 3, all work on the 2 was suspended indefinitely. There were 3 main lines of investigation: the wreckage, the detailed flight testing of another comet, and the pressure testing of yet another. The comet was made from over 1 million separate parts, any one of which might contain a vital clue. The Royal Navy had salvaged virtually 70% of Yoke Peter, but would it be enough? BOAC's impressed Comet 1, Yoke Uncle, was stripped of its furnishings, engines and equipment and delivered by road to Farnborough, where it was to be reassembled. It had flown about 3,500 hours, the same as the Elba Comet. It was decided to construct a new type of test rig. A site was cleared and work started on a water testing tank of huge capacity. The idea was to fill the tank and aircraft with water simultaneously, and then increase the water pressure in the cabin to simulate the differential that occurs in normal flight. This tank, pressurized with air to the point of destruction, shows vividly what could have happened if cabin air pressure failed. The reassembled Yoke Uncle was wheeled to the partially completed tank. Since it was intended to simulate wing loading and wind gusting, it was necessary for the wings to protrude through the side of the tank to enable a certain amount of flexing. Lead ballast was added to Yoke Uncle to simulate passenger load, and final preparations were made for filling the tank. Once filled, the tests began that were to simulate 11 hours of pressurized flight every 21 minutes. Hydraulically operated mechanisms supplied the right amount of stress and load, which had been carefully calculated by analyzing the records of 2,000 flying hours of comets on BOAC routes. As the tank tests continued, the wreckage from the Mediterranean was examined minutely. Little by little, as the twisted parts were pieced together, some curious things were found. The impression of a 1 anna piece, probably from a passenger's pocket, was testimony to Yoke Peter's violent last moments. To support the investigations on the ground, an operational Comet, Able Victor, was subjected to an extensive series of flight tests. The passenger cabin was stripped of fittings, and recording instruments and strain gauges were applied throughout the aircraft. The pilots, all RAF officers of the Experimental Flying Department, were accompanied by civilian scientific staff from Farnborough and flying personnel from DeHavilland's. The stringent tests required the aircraft to fly unpressurized. Structural vibrations were recorded, and measurements concerning the flying characteristics of the aircraft were made, together with engine temperature measurement and even cabin heating efficiency. Constantly, information from the ground tests was incorporated into the flight programs, and vice versa. These flight tests, all 70 of them, monitored activity at 60 different points in the aircraft, and over the period, Able Victor flew a distance equivalent to that twice round the world. Suddenly, when the equivalent to a full life of Yoke Uncle was about 4.5 times that of the Elba Comet, a major breakthrough occurred. A crack developed rapidly by a port side window, and suddenly the cabin was ripped open for a length of over 15 feet. This major failure confirmed that the structure of the escape hatches and windows was vulnerable, and metal fatigue was proved in subsequent laboratory tests to have been the cause. The examination of the Elba wreckage, proceeding simultaneously, confirmed that the failure started at a direction-finding aerial window in the roof of the cabin. The failure began in the rear one of 2 ADF windows and spread rapidly forward. On the other side of the window, the crack ran aft. The internal pressure forced the 2 halves upwards, and breaking away, they were projected violently along the wings. Paint traces and deep scratches in the salvaged wing confirmed the pattern of events. Then a portion of the fuselage structure was blown backwards by the airstream and struck the tailplane. The breakup of the aircraft followed rapidly. The rear fuselage came away folding downwards about the rear spar, and then fell into the sea with the open end downwards. The aircraft, now nose-heavy, dived towards the sea with its wings folding downwards. About the same time, the nose separated, and the center section, complete with engines, turned over and descended in a spin, landing upside down in the water. Great Britain's wonder plane was finished.